Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to a special edition of the Daily Friend Show. I'm your host, Nicholas Lorimer, today joined by John Endres, Terence Corrigan, and Marius Roodt to talk about South Africa's most recent elections. We are starting to get a very significant chunk of the results through now, so I think we can finally say some things with some sort of authority. And it has been a fascinating election and a monumental one, I think, for the politics of South Africa. We have seen for the first time in South Africa's democratic history, the ANC looks almost certain to be losing its majority of the in Parliament, getting somewhere in the low 40s in terms of vote share. If you look at the IEC website while we're currently recording this, it's about 62% of the voting stations have reported their results, and the ANC is on 41.89%. The DA, 22, just under 23%. And the new party on the block, MK, coming through with a really strong 11.7% so far. I think we are set for a bit of change in this. Not all of the MK voters in fact, they may finish closer to 14% of the votes, which would be higher than I think most polls predicted. The EFF not doing so great, the IFP not doing so great, the Patriotic Alliance, the PA, having a reasonable election, but not amazingly kind of breakthrough, but definitely their best result ever. The Freedom Front Plus going backwards slightly. Action SA really not having a great election, but at least getting some seats in Parliament. The ACDP not having a great election. And the newer parties, Build One South Africa with Mmusi Maimane and Rise Mzansi, doing really badly, maybe just securing one, or if they're lucky, 2 seats in Parliament this time. So a lot to talk about and a lot to go through. I think let's just start with a bit of an introductory thoughts. I'll go through each of you guys and we can talk about that. John, what are your thoughts on how this election is playing out?
Well, I think we've called it a watershed election for a while now, and that is very much what I'm seeing here. Maybe to an even greater extent than we had anticipated. The ANC dropping not just below 50%, but quite far below 50%. And I think what this produces is a forced choice for the ANC, which in the past could pride itself on being a broad church and uniting many distinct flavors within it. Now it will have to choose whether it goes left or right. So going left would be to choose to go into an alliance or coalition with MK and or the EFF, or on the other hand, remaining sort of on the moderate side, going center-right with the DA. That is the choice it now has to make. And on that hinges a lot and the future of South Africa's development, really. Nick.
Marius, your initial thoughts on seeing this election result?
Yeah, I can't disagree too much with John. I think it's what they like to call in America a realigning election. And I think we must also be too cautious about thinking this about the long-term effects of this. It all depends what MK Party does. And if they don't really have any legs, I mean, I think it's quite possible that the MK Party collapses within a year or two. And voters go back to the ANC, whatever the case is. So it all depends if it's got any legs. But I think this will also been a psychological change for a lot of people, because it's the first time the ANC's gone under 50% in the national election. And obviously a lot of MK voters would have been former ANC voters. And even if MK does collapse, they might be people who before wouldn't have considered switching their vote, but they did it after MK. And now they aren't necessarily going to be solid ANC voters anymore. So, but also that all said, the ANC is still the biggest party in most provinces. It's still got 3/4 of the vote in Limpopo, over 60% in the Eastern Cape and Northwest. So if you take MK away, that's actually where the ANC's been bleeding from. The DA didn't really manage to do much. The PA took a little bit away from the ANC, and the EFF seems to have gone a little bit backwards, actually. So I think the big story is obviously MK, I think.
Terence, your thoughts?
I think that what this tells us is that the era of dominant party politics in South Africa and elections being mere restatements of the incumbents' claim to rule is probably not at an end. and this is important. We've had the ANC for 30 years. Prior to that, it was the National Party going back into the 1940s. This opens the door for, I think, truly unpredictable competitive electoral politics, which is something that South Africans are not familiar with. On the other hand, even given these changes, the election went fairly smoothly. South Africa is a democracy, no matter how challenged. It's a free society, and those are significant assets that we can build on.
Yeah, I think one of the big takeaways for me is that it's pretty unlikely, in my opinion, that the any political party will ever get more than 50% of the vote, or at least not for many years to come, many elections to come in South Africa's elections. I think our biggest parties are probably going to cap out somewhere in the 30s or maybe even high 20s in elections going forward. I wouldn't be surprised if the ANC sees further splits after this. Although I think you guys raise a very good point by talking about the instability of MK. So let's just talk a little bit about that choice that they could make. We don't know who the ANC is going to go into coalition with in order to secure its position in the presidency. I assume that's the most likely outcome from this set of results. However, we have seen already that MK has kind of, at least a senior MK member has said that they're not going to go into coalition with the ANC now. I mean, I'm not really sure if I believe that. But John, what do you make about, can you expand further on what you said about their choice of direction to go in? And what do you think are the most likely coalition outcomes right now?
I think a lot hinges on who is in charge at the ANC. So if the current leadership remains in place, that being President Ramaphosa and his loyal followers around him, then I think the ANC will go towards a DA coalition, or maybe a minority government with DA support. That I think is the path that offers the most stability and respectability for the ANC. However, if President Ramaphosa should be forced out as a result of this rather underwhelming election result, then I think all bets are off, and then I think the door is open again to the EFF and MK. And ANC members might also blame Mr. Ramaphosa for having allowed former President Zuma into the position that he so usefully exploited. He was imprisoned and then released a few hours later. Otherwise, he might still be in jail now. And how different things might have been. Nick?
Yes, I've remarked the entire campaign on that, and it must be one of the most horrifying own goals I think I've ever seen in South African politics. The fact that the ANC soft-pedaled the prosecution of Zuma, that they've given him so much cover, that they made so many excuses for him, that they bent the rules and they made exceptions for him here and there, and then he turns around and he crushes them in KZN. We don't know what the final KZN result is going to be, but if we look at the province at the moment, MK is likely to be the biggest party. They are sitting on around, I think it's 40 something percent of the vote. The ANC going all the way down to 18% right now. Now, the ANC's vote may recover a bit. You can see on this map that we've got here that quite a few voting districts are still not in. I think some of those are MK backing, but some of those are also IFP, ANC, and DA backing. So we'll have to see what the final result is. Marius, can you talk a little bit more about what you think about the future of MK? Are they being serious when they talk about not wanting to go into a coalition with the ANC? What do you make of this?
It's hard to say. The EFF was in 2016, I think it was. Also said it didn't want to go into coalition with the ANC. It backed the DA in a couple of places. And I think we might see something similar here where MK will maybe initially not want to go into coalition with the ANC to punish it. We might see, then the ANC might be forced to go with the DA. But who knows? I don't think there's, it's all things are all pretty uncertain at the moment. I mean, but there's another possibility. It's probably quite a slim one, but a DA, MK, EFF, and MPC coalition would probably be enough to just get over 50%. So, and then we could see the ANC on the opposition benches. It's probably not that likely, but yeah, it's. I don't think it's completely impossible.
So I've seen one of the narratives I've seen about this election already is that there is this kind of view on this election that, it's only MK who did anything here. All the other parties were completely irrelevant. And that, if you just put the MK, EFF, and ANC together, that nothing has changed in South African politics. I don't think that that's entirely correct. For a start, if you kind of put what we expect the ANC, MK, and EFF to get together, that's actually below 2/3, which means that even if all those parties band together, they're unlikely to be able to change the constitution. And I do think that MK has kind of filled a bit of a special. I don't think most South African voters actually sort of see the country as divided necessarily into those two blocks. And I think you'll find that a lot of MK voters are, much like a lot of EFF voters, actually a little bit more complex in that, the fact they might go from the MK to IFP, from MK to the EFF, maybe even to another party, is a lot more possible. I think that the idea that they're never going to, they're always going to stay within that ANC block is not correct. As I can't remember who said, I think it was John who said it, we've crossed a sort of psychological threshold, and once these people are broken away, the option of voting for someone else becomes much higher. Who, I can't say. Terence, what do you make of all this?
I think that there's an interesting lesson from the past. The psychological point is very important. And I think that if you go back to 1989, to the election in the old White Parliament. Interesting situation there. The National Party came out with I think it was 48%, the first time it had scored below 50% since the 1950s. It then managed a recovery of sorts in 1994, but by 2004 it effectively ceased to exist. I think parties used to incumbency do not fare well when that is taken away from them, or when that is challenged. And I think the ANC is entering a period where it's going to struggle. I'm not sure that MK really knows what it's going to do with its influence, or with its potential influence. And I'm not sure that the EFF is geared up for actual governance either. Its approach seems to vary somewhat, vary between wanting to be the opposition and wanting to be the government. But I think you have to choose one or the other. What I suspect we'll find is a great deal of instability in the next couple of years, as we try to navigate this. The virtue of sorts of dominant party politics is that it does give certainty and structure to things. You kind of knew that the ANC was going to be there no matter what. That I think is no longer the case.
So, John, I've got a little bit of delay in my video here, so apologies if my face is not syncing up with my words. But anyway,
That was very disconcerting for me.
Yes, just ignore that, I think. So the DA, let's talk about them a little bit. You mentioned in our pre-show discussion here that it looks like all of the sort of big mainstream parties that have been around on the block for a while have lost support to newer entrants, kind of except the DA, at least an overall total. Now, it's kind of difficult, I think, to look at this election for the DA. And I think your view on it is going to very much depend on what your sort of starting favorability towards the DA is. You could look at this election and say, DA's done badly. It's, it might fall slightly below its 2014 parliamentary result, even if it's slightly grown from its 2019 parliamentary result, that it's failing to make the headway that it's been trying to make for many decades, and that the party is kind of sort of stuck in stasis. An alternative view you can take, if you're more favorable to the party, is perhaps that facing an unprecedented amount of challenge from new, much better funded, much better organized opponents in the opposition space, that the party has actually managed to kind of hold the line and remain as the undisputed leader of South Africa's opposition, being the second biggest party, probably by quite a lot. Even if MK goes up to sort of 14% of the vote, the DA is going to still be at least 7 points ahead of them. So what do you make of that? And what do you make of what's driving the reduction in support for all of the, as you described, the mainstream parties?
I think that the DA has actually done really well in confounding its critics' expectations. So if you happen to frequent social media, you would have seen social democrat left-wing critics of the DA suggest that the party would drop catastrophically in its support. After 2019, it went through a bit of a reorientation towards the classically liberal roots. And the expectation of these critics was that it would drop to 15% or 18% or something like that. And that clearly hasn't happened. What has also been remarkable is that alternatives for those critics have popped up who could not conceive of voting for the DA and rejected it for various reasons. They now had the option of voting for Action SA, for Rise Mzansi, for Build One South Africa, but they did not take those options, at least not to any large extent. So I think for the DA, this has been a successful election. I think they would have wanted to achieve a higher result, but I think given the circumstances, they did really well. And this is also significant because the DA is a racially and ideologically, I think, very diverse party in a heterogeneous country. So the expectation of some observers was that the vote in South Africa would now split along identitarian and ethnic lines. But the IFP hasn't really grown. The Freedom Front Plus hasn't really grown. The PA has grown, I suppose. The MK could be seen as an ethnic party, but the DA has stuck to its roots and to its non-racial orientation. It's classically liberal orientation, and it has succeeded in doing so. And I think it's got a base for growth. I think that amongst its supporters and its voters, there are more black people than voted for parties like Rise Mzansi or Action SA or many of these other parties. So really quite good. We also heard many critics say that the DA would never be successful while it had a white leader. That is a very common narrative we hear in South Africa. And I think really it matters more the quality of the leader than the race of the leader. And that is something that the DA should stick to as it goes forward. But overall, I think they've done quite well. Also done well to hold on to the Western Cape. Nicholas.
Yeah, Marius, what do you make of the DA's performance? So we don't have all the results in from the Western Cape, but the projections from a lot of political analysts and news commentators and such is that the DA is probably going to remain the majority party in the Western Cape, not having to form any coalitions there. Do you think they'll be happy overall with this result?
Yeah, I think so. They'll have gone increased overall. And I was looking about an hour ago on these preliminary results. They've increased their support in 6 out of the 9 provinces. So that's obviously pretty good for them. They seem to have not really, or they seem to have got some of their Freedom Front Plus support back. And while they've gone backwards in the Western Cape, they've probably lost a bit of support to the PA. But I think the ANC, the PA took more of the ANC support than the DA support. So they'll obviously be a little bit disappointed, I think, because they're going to finish on about 52 or 53 in the Western Cape, where they got nearly 60% 2 elections ago. So that's maybe a slight cause for concern, because their majority is obviously a little bit softer than I think they would like in the Western Cape. But it's still, I mean, they're obviously going to have they'll easily be able to govern the province. But yeah, but I think on balance, the DA will be pretty happy with what they've done. And it looks like, and yeah, I mean, given the ANC's collapse, they've set themselves up quite well to be a possible coalition partner for the ANC, not just nationally, but in a couple of provinces as well.
So let's talk a little bit about, firstly, Terence, your thoughts on how the DA has performed, but secondly, also, what you think of this idea of the DA and ANC going to coalition with each other. And I'll also just get John and Marius's thoughts on that. Is that a good idea, bad idea, or it depends?
Well, look, what the as far as the DA's performance goes, I think it's done satisfactorily. It hasn't grown significantly, but it has, I think, seen off a number of challenges. Um, I, I do take a somewhat different view that perhaps the sort of universe of support it has at the moment, or that quantum, may well be kind of what a large party in South Africa can expect to get going forward. That I've often had to field questions from people. Why can't the DA, with its record in government or whatever, get 60% of the vote? People should be streaming to it. And I don't think that that's really a helpful analysis. I just don't think that that's the way politics will function in a society like South Africa. On the other hand, yeah, I share the sentiments that Marius and John have put forward. As far as coalitions go, look, my view is that a coalition. We are still, I think, trapped in pre-May 29 thinking that we know a majority government of some description. If one party don't get it, then two parties must sit in government together to create it. I don't think that a coalition between the DA and the ANC would be stable. I don't think it would be stable between the ANC and the EFF or MK either. And what I've suggested, and what has been suggested from the Institute stable, is a sort of supply agreement. Perhaps let the ANC form a minority government with certain guarantees, but on legislative issues, things will need to be negotiated one at a time. I do think, though, that the DA would find itself in a very, very difficult situation if their supporters would, in a sense, never forgive them for keeping the ANC in power, but I think would never forgive them if the DA passed up an opportunity to go, to access power and pass that on to a coalition between the ANC and the EFF. Either way, it's sort of damned if you do, damned if you don't. So
yeah, I think Parliament is going to become a much more interesting and important place now in South African elections. With the ANC not just being able to kind of push things through with their majority, it's actually going to have to be quite a lot of negotiation and management of different political factions. And in that environment, I think the DA should actually look as its model at what the EFF did in 2016, where the EFF essentially didn't go into government with the DA and a bunch of municipalities, but managed to extract a lot of concessions from the DA government from outside of a formal coalition, essentially supporting them on a case-by-case basis. And I think that's very much the model that they should follow if they want to have success. If they do take on government, I suspect that while there might be some short-term stability, ultimately either the DA would have to give up on its sort of principles and policies, or it would probably just, the government would just collapse and it wouldn't end up being as stable as we thought. John, what do you make of that? No, I think we may have lost John there.
Yeah, I think I just went offline for a moment, but I'm back now.
Yes, sorry, John, your thoughts on DA coalition with the ANC? How would it work? Would it be a good idea, bad idea? What do you think is the best route for them to take?
I think that really the dominant option for both parties is to go the ANC minority government with DA confidence supply support. And the reason for that is that it allows the ANC, it gives some breathing space to the ANC, which I think it needs now if it wants to regroup. I think now introducing coalition government, whatever form, into the government is going to introduce a lot of volatility. If it's between the DA and the ANC, there are certain incompatibilities in terms of policy between them, in terms of governance, in terms of accountability. So I think that relationship would not last long. That's my sense. I think if the EFF or the MK were taken into government, they would attempt to hijack the ANC. So that's a big risk for the ANC as well. And I think they would do so successfully. So the ANC must be aware of that threat. And so a really attractive option is to say, okay, I've only got 42% of the vote, but we're going to get the DA to help us elect an ANC president who can form an ANC cabinet. And we'll get the commitment from the DA that it won't participate in votes of no confidence against our government. And it will give us the votes we need to pass a budget. And that is the whole extent of the agreement. And I think from the perspective of the DA, the drawback is that you don't become a minister and you don't get the benefit of being driven around in chauffeured limousines with blue light convoys escorting you. But I think you are playing the responsible role in the long term because you are conserving a really fantastic opposition party, with its 20%, 25%. It plays such an important role in the political balance in South Africa. Just having them around in that role is so important that role needs to be conserved. And going into coalition with the ANC would put that at risk. So I think confidence and supply, an ANC minority government is the way to go.
Marius, what do you make of all this? The ANC seems to be in an incredibly difficult position now. It's sort of, as John has laid out, it's got these kind of two different routes it can take, and both are just fraught with an enormous amount of peril. If you wanted to keep the ANC alive as South Africa's biggest political party going forward, what would you do in terms of coalitions?
Yeah, I think the minority government with confidence and supply is probably the best option for the ANC. I think a formal coalition between the ANC and the DA would be bad for both parties, I think. People would, say the ANC betrayed the revolution or whatever, and the DA would get, I think, a stick for kind of keeping the ANC in power. But also, as John says, if the ANC and MK get involved, then I think definitely EFF, I think, would try some sort of reverse takeover that probably demands some quite important positions. Julius Malema already said he's quite willing to go into coalition with the ANC, but he'd want the Minister of Finance, which is obviously, I don't think the ANC would be willing to even consider that. I don't know, a 9% party can demand Minister of Finance, and the EFF had some very interesting financial kind of issues in its manifesto, where it's going to increase the kind of childcare grant to R1 million a month or something, or whatever it was, all unfunded. So yeah, I don't think the ANC will do that, and I think the ANC is also, they are watching the markets, and I think they know that an ANC EFF formal coalition will be absolutely terrifying to investors, whether they are in South Africa or abroad. And that'll cause quite a few problems for the ANC. We've already seen how the forward rates on South African government bonds have spiked over the last couple of days because of investors are worried about what the future could be. And I think the ANC also knows that if they can't pay for stuff, then they're going to be out, and they'll definitely be out in the next election then. So I think, and that's also assuming that South Africa is still a democracy, obviously, in 2029. I would argue it's most probably going to be, but I don't think it's something we can just assume.
So let's talk a little bit about some of the smaller parties here. I'm going to start again with you, John. So when I say smaller parties, I'm thinking the IFP, the Patriotic Alliance, Freedom Front Plus, Action SA, and then also I just want to talk quickly about the two parties that had, I think, quite a lot of space in the media and had quite a lot of funding, which were Build One SA with Musi Maimane and Rise Mzansi. So on first inspection, let's put the PA and IFP to the side. Action SA, Rise Mzansi, Build One SA. Those parties really don't seem to have had a particularly good election. Action SA will get into parliament, which they hadn't stood for a parliamentary election before, so they will get at least, looks like maybe 4 seats or 5 seats right now. So that's nothing to kind of turn your nose up at. You can do things with that. But Rise Mzansi and Build One SA, maybe 1 seat each, maybe 2 seats each. Not a great result. What do you make of this, John?
It looks like maybe the message of those parties didn't really resonate with the voters. Thinking now specifically of Rise Mzansi, which I think, it was a kind of had earnest, I would say, messaging, but in a way quite similar in terms of policy to the ANC. And maybe voters didn't see enough of a differentiator there to pick Rise over the ANC, and so just basically ignored it. I see it's on 0.4%. That's maybe a seat, maybe 2 seats in parliament. Bosa with Musi Maimane also didn't gain traction, and I think was probably not aggressive enough, even though we saw its campaign posters around town. But otherwise, it did, I think, not have enough presence in the media. What is noteworthy on Rise is that it got very favorable coverage, I thought, in the media. We saw Songezo Zibi being interviewed on CNN, I think yesterday or the day before yesterday, and otherwise also getting some very favorable coverage. But that does not seem to have translated into votes. As for Action SA, I'm sure they would have they were expecting to do much better than they are at the moment. Projections, I think we saw were around 2 to 3% for Action SA, but it looks like they are going to get stuck below that level. So that's going to be a disappointing result. If I remember the numbers from Johannesburg correctly, so I think from this area, which should be its heartland, its strongest base, it hasn't really performed very highly here. Yeah, so these small parties didn't quite gain traction as they had expected. But I think we'll have to talk about MK and the PA as well, which are newer parties which have done quite well. But I'll hand back to you here, Nick.
Marius, your thoughts on the smallest parties this election? I'm thinking specifically of Rise and Build One SA.
Well, I suppose getting into Parliament is an achievement to start off with, but considering how much money, especially Rise got, and the column inches they were given to Rise Mzansi, you'd think it's been not a great return on investment. But now they do have a platform. I mean, you can't really do too much with 2 seats, but the DP only got 7 seats in 1994. And it showed you can use, if you're clever, you can use that as a platform. And we saw the DP then go from 1.7% of the votes, obviously a bit more than what Rise and Bosa got, to 9% in the next election, and eventually became the DA, now the second biggest party in South Africa, and it governs the Western Cape. So it all depends. It all remains to be seen whether people like Songezo Zibi and Musi Maimane want to do the hard work of the donkey work of being in Parliament and so on. We've seen some small parties come that are going to be the saviors of South African politics, like a Gang from Mampele, and they only got, I think, 2 seats in the first election they ran in, which was 2014. And Mampele decided not even to take up her seats in Parliament. So it's a springboard that parties can use. And overall, I think they'll both be fairly disappointed. But, they're still going into Parliament. It's still a decent achievement. And if they use it properly, we could maybe see them get more popular over the next 5 years, but it's going to be hard work for them. And I think they'll realize politics is not for sissies, as the saying goes.
Terence, before we move on to some of the others, what are your thoughts on those two specifically?
I think that the macro issue here is that running a campaign, running a political party with prospects is a very big, expensive, and complicated project. And I'm not sure that new entrants often fully appreciate this. On Bosa, I think it was very, very personalized around Musi Maimane, and I think that there was something that started to suggest to me an aura of pretentiousness, that he was campaigning as South Africa's elder statesman without having been a younger statesman, if you'll pardon the analogy. As though he kind of had all this, he had the solutions if only you'd put him in charge. And I think there was I was left wondering exactly what the offering was. For Rise Mzansi, I will give them this. I think they did understand the need to have structures to build some sort of party infrastructure. And I think that I do think that there's a sort of viable idea there. Maybe it's not huge, but a kind of welfare as social democratic party. Appealing to particularly some parts of the middle class. Maybe that's 4 or 5% of your vote going forward. But once again, that depends, and I think one of the that depends on whether you're going to stick it out. And it seems to me that Mr. Zivi has an illustrious career in corporates and in the media and whatever, but he didn't have a political background, and so kind of lacked that recognition. Something that he's going to have to build. As far as Action SA goes, I was surprised because I do think, in terms of what the polling tells us about people's value orientations, I do think that they have a fairly marketable product, and I think that we'll need to see the results coming from Gauteng particularly. But yes, I do think rather disappointing for them. Once again, will Mr. Mashaba, hack it out for another 5 years and have another bite at it?
Right. I think, as I said, politics, or at least Parliament, is going to be sort of in many ways now the new center of politics, and in that light, there's a lot of opportunity for some of these parties that have just managed to get into Parliament to make something of it. Now, I don't know if they will be able to. In fact, I think that it's going to be very difficult, but that is the path for them, I think, if they want to grow from this kind of I think, disappointing entrance. Very briefly, let's just talk. I'll start with you again, John, about the IFP, PA, and Freedom Front Plus. All three of those parties are sort of associated with being kind of like slightly regional, or sort of maybe sort of like, you could crassly call them maybe ethnic parties. Freedom Front Plus not doing great, not doing terribly, going backwards from where they got in 2019. The Patriotic Alliance shooting way up from where they did in 2019. And while we don't know what the final result for the IFP is going to be, we do know that it's going to be pretty close to what they got last time. So sort of where they've always been. What do you make of this, John?
Yeah, so I think the IFP probably would have done better had it not been for MK. But I think MK really absorbed a lot of the Zulu votes, clearly, in that province, KwaZulu-Natal, at the expense of the IFP, as well as the ANC and the EFF. And they won't be too happy with that result. We'll have to go back to the drawing board and see what they can do about that. The Freedom Front Plus, similarly, I think gained some votes from the DA around 2019. It might have lost those votes back to the DA now. And so it's probably back at the level I would imagine that it was in 2014. And the PA, I think, is one of the big breakout stories, one of the two really fast-growing parties, together with MK. And in the case of the PA, I think also very much driven by a personality with very firm viewpoints and the ability to demonstrate conviction and, I think, authenticity. This is something that struck me during the American presidential campaign 2015, 2016, that I think one of the reasons that Trump did quite well is that he was seen as being authentic, while his rival was not. And I think that helped get him across the line. And I think that same kind of authenticity is attributed to Gate McKenzie and helped that party in the elections, especially with the colored voters. Nick?
Marius, your thoughts on those three, particularly the PA?
Yeah, it's obviously been a pretty good election for the PA. They also kind of found a strand that South Africans like. Gates McKenzie is a bit of a strange guy. I think he's sometimes a bit all over the place. Listen to him sometimes at those biz news interviews, and for a while you think, geez, like, this guy's actually speaking sense. Then he starts going on about how he's going to kick every single foreigner out and wants to, bring religion back into schools and stuff. And you think, oh no. But obviously there's something that resonates with people. And with the other two parties, I think Freedom Front Plus will be, I think, a bit disappointed. The last election was their best ever, but they seem to have gone a little bit backwards here. And they've always been a pretty solid coalition partner for the DA. But I wouldn't be surprised if they would also maybe be willing to prop up an ANC government. I think Peter Mulder, the previous leader of Freedom Front Plus, was a deputy cabinet minister in the first Zuma cabinet. So yeah, I mean, obviously the kind of parties who campaign overtly on kind of ethnicity and so on. They all did pretty poorly except for MK, obviously. But I think with MK, it's all quite complicated. Obviously, the big issue that propelled MK was the Zulu nationalist vote, but also a lot of it was around Jacob Zuma's personal appeal. But that's also partly his personal appeal is, I think, because he's a Zulu. And I wonder if there's some kind of maybe people in KwaZulu-Natal feel a bit that they've excluded from national life. There's no Zulu in the ANC top 8, I think it is now. That was the first time for quite a long time. And R.W. Johnson, when he was writing about the first initial market data results, which showed how well MK was doing, he said there's a real feeling of rebellion in the air in KwaZulu-Natal. And I think that's something also when you talk about possible hints of secession in KZN. I don't think that is super unlikely. And KZN's always been kind of province where, I mean, obviously in the 1980s and early 1990s, there were talks about secession. And even before that, Natal was always the most reluctant member of the union. So, yeah, I think if people who are, France Cronje always like to say, if people want Western Cape secession, they must look to Natal. And the road to Cape independence runs through Lundi. So I think that's also something that should be flagged. And I don't think something we can just dismiss as being part of the lunatic fringe or anything like that anymore.
Terence, you're from Natal. Tell us a little bit what you think about the results. It's interesting to me that despite MK's kind of dominance over big parts of KZN, that the IFP is still actually going to, it looks like, hold on to its heartland. I mean, we'll see what happens when the next election comes, but it sort of remains a remarkably resilient party in that sense. But, we're looking at the KZN results here. As you can see from the map that I've got up here, a lot of the results, particularly it seems from the IFP heartland and also from some of these areas which seem to be going for MK, haven't come in yet. So we still don't know what the final percentages will be, but it looks like, I don't know, maybe even the MK will get very close to majority in KZN.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. I think that KZN has had for a long time, it's had kind of a unique political environment or political culture. If you want to describe this as Zulu ethnicity, I don't think that's entirely inaccurate. And within that sort of milieu, people have changed, have from the IFP to the ANC back MK. I think that the appeals are substantively similar. And yeah, I think that those sentiments have endured strongly enough, and in a particular enough form that it's enabled the IFP to endure. I remember in the early 1990s, a lot of very clever people saying, the IFP was essentially a 1% party, a creature of the apartheid state. As soon as we have democracy, they'll fade quickly, and they really have no autonomous existence. And I think that was that just failed to understand the dynamics. So yeah, I imagine they will be around for some time. I think that if MK does experience turbulence, which I think is more likely than not, that will provide an opportunity for the IFP. I think that Gauteng McKenzie and the PA, interesting dynamic there. Something that I think speaks to a general crisis of confidence in the political class as a whole, intersecting with, I think, particularly a sense of marginalization felt by a lot of brown people in South Africa. The word populism is often used. I think sometimes overused in South Africa, but Mackenzie has a particular life story which many people find very very compelling. He's got a very direct and earthy way of speaking, and he's willing to say things that people feel, but maybe reticent to say themselves, and to sort of stick it to power brokers in both directions. I think he probably spent more of this election attacking the DA than he did the ANC, because I imagine that's where he thought he could prize more support from. Which I think, incidentally, is probably also true of a party like Rise Mzansi and possibly also BOSA. That the assumption is that there are opposition inclined voters, DA supporters, if you will, are more accessible and available to other opposition parties than the ANC. So I think a disproportionate amount of these sort of newbie insurgent parties went on attacking the established opposition, then going after the ANC.
So, John, go ahead.
Yeah, just wondering if these results reflect a moderate electorate or a radical electorate. And looking at the numbers, I think this is reflective of a moderate electorate, which has been our assessment for many years now, also based on our polling. I think a clear radical appeal was made by the EFF, but it did not translate into an increase in votes. I think that MK's appeal was not so much radical as personality-based and driven by disgruntlement with the ANC. So it's actually, in that sense at least, not a bad outcome. I think this is a moderate electorate reflecting its preferences and also a normalization of South Africa's democracy towards a broader spread of support across more parties.
Well, on that point, let's talk a little bit more about how the EFF has done and what we can expect maybe from Gauteng. So just over half of voting stations in for Gauteng at the moment, which is not a lot. You can see there's big chunks of the map still missing here. So the final numbers will look different, but basically we can say a number of things. We can say that the EFF is kind of in a similar place to where it was in 2019, if not slightly down. MK doing better than I think anyone expected in Gauteng, getting maybe 10% of the vote, maybe a little bit less. We'll have to see. Action SA not doing great, but still having a presence, beating out the Freedom Front Plus. The DA staying pretty much where it was in Gauteng, and the ANC, of course, taking a massive beating, going down from about 50% to the last one. So, Marius, let me start with you. What do you make of the prospects for Gauteng, and also what do you make about how the EFF is doing?
Yeah, Gauteng is going to be a bit of a mess, I think. As it stands, the ANC won't be able to govern with the EFF. They'll need somebody else to help push them over the line. So now that means an ANC EFF MK coalition or an ANC DA coalition. So it's all pretty fluid at the moment still. And I think the EFF will be pretty, they won't be that happy with this result. They haven't really managed to kick on from 2014 or 2019. They've been doing, they went backwards on preliminary results. They went backwards in places like Limpopo and Northwest, which places they've done pretty well traditionally. And those are also two provinces where MK hasn't really done much. In Limpopo and Northwest, the MK is on around about 1%. So in KwaZulu-Natal, EFF has really had absolutely shocking elections. Went from nearly 10% of the vote in 2019 to only about 2% now. And obviously, a lot of its vote has gone to MK. But as I say, it hasn't managed to really kick on in any other parts of the country. I was even in Polokwane, which is a place that used to do pretty well. It's only on about 12% of the vote at the moment, I think. So yeah, overall, I think this is a pretty poor election for the EFF. And I don't know, I think Julius Malema runs that party with an iron fist. So I'm not sure we'll see any kind of people trying to knife him in the back or whatever. But I do think that he's not as his position probably isn't as firm as it once was, and he's probably got some reason to look over his shoulder now, I think.
I think honestly the answer to why the EFF hasn't done so well is two parts. One is, John, what you said about a moderate electorate, but two is that I think Malema has actually run that party far too tightly. This is the problem with if you don't allow space for other leaders to grow up in your party, if you make it too much of a personality cult. Malema has had this habit in recent years of kind of almost humiliating some of his MPs and public reps. So when there were certain public reps of the EFF who failed to be able to bring enough supporters to the EFF's 10-year anniversary birthday bash. He very publicly fired them, including apparently one of his best organizers in KZN. And I think that is definitely a contributor to the EFF not doing so great. It's not just that MK has taken some of their votes. It's also just that they couldn't, Malema has not allowed his organization to develop and breathe beyond him. John, do you agree with me? What do you make?
Yeah, and I think I'd add to that as well that I think the appeal of the EFF has been the excitement that it generated. So the constant air of disruption and innovation and novelty. But after 10 years, it's still the same story, and I think that the novelty is wearing off a bit now, and that's probably another reason why it's not seeing its support grow. I think it's like maintaining outrage. You can be outraged for a while, but after a while, you tire a bit, and then you sort of have to get on with things. And it may be that the EFF is now at that point where disruption and sort of promising anarchy and violent revolution isn't really the message that resonates. I must say one thing, maybe in Julius Malema's defense, though, which is an interview clip I saw of him, sort of a pre-election, saying that if the EFF didn't do well, he would accept that, and he was not going to blame the IEC or being treated unfairly. He said that the EFF had the ability to campaign freely, speak freely. It did so, and if people decided not to vote for it, then that was the EFF's fault, and not that of the IEC or of other parties. And that I thought was a mature statement for him to make, and that deserves respect. Nick?
I do think, from at least my impression, that the EFF kind of tried to go for a slightly softer approach in terms of how it campaigned this election. There were calls for restraint when there was political violence in Limpopo from the EFF. There was their main poster that the EFF put up, I thought, was actually one that made Julius look very friendly. It wasn't the same sort of kind of harsh, I'm going to cut the throat of whiteness revolutionary look that he goes for sometimes. So I think that was quite interesting, and we'll have to see whether the EFF changes strategy after this. Terence, any final thoughts on the EFF and also on how Gauteng is shaping up so far?
Gauteng, I think, will kind of be the bellwether of the future, because I don't know if anyone's going to be able to take over, certainly not individually, but even in combination with one partner. I think this is going to be complicated, and I really don't know how this will be sorted out. And that's a big issue given how important Gauteng is to South Africa's economy. That we could end up with a situation not unlike what we had with in the city of Joburg, with councils and playing musical chairs. As far as the EFF goes, I think that a lot of its initial appeal was as a kind of protest against the ANC, but also not so much because of any suite of ideological offerings, but because it put forward this impression of strength and vigor. Osama bin Laden, I like to remind everyone, said, "If you see a strong horse and a weak horse, you bet on the strong horse." And I think this was what attracted a lot of people. Now, in this campaign, I think that I think over the last couple of years they've started to run out of steam, and the novelty just isn't there anymore. But more than that, in this campaign, there seemed to be a tension between trying to present themselves as worthy of being the government in waiting, and also being ardent revolutionaries. And I'm not sure that you can reconcile those, and I don't think they did. I think people who wanted the sort of who wanted the strong horse and to stick it to the ANC from within their kind of liberation movement tradition were at least a good part of them were more inclined to go to MK. Certainly, just on the question of moderation, values polling does show this, that the EFF's policy offerings, those sort of things, are not particularly popular. And we did a survey some years ago, where we asked people by political affiliation what issues were important to them. and frankly, EFF support is not particularly interested in the issues that the EFF kept on foregrounding.
I also just think it's quite.
That's always. Go ahead,
I
Marius.
was going to say, I think it's quite interesting just looking on social media. I don't know if there's my particular, I mean, just the kind of tweets I see and stuff, but people are much more critical of the DA and saying, oh, they only grew by 1% when the ANC is so terrible. But you don't see the same people saying the EFF went backwards. I mean, as it stands now, they've lost more than 1%, 4 percentage points of the vote. And as I say, they haven't really kicked on from that good start they had in 2014, and also they did all right in 2019. They obviously grew a bit in 2019. So I think just shows the kind of different standards that the DA and the EFF are held to by quite a lot of people in the media and our chattering classes. But also, yeah, I do think Malema has also moderated his kind of rhetoric a bit. He's obviously still, I mean, far too left wing for for my liking. But I think he just before the election, I mean, he was speaking at, I think it was FNB. You know, and he was quite moderate. You know, he wasn't wearing the beret and the overall. He was wearing a suit and all that kind of thing. Although he did still say some crazy stuff like everything will be nationalized and all land will belong to the government under an EFF government. So that's obviously not stuff that you know, no investor in their right mind is going to put money in a country where that's what the government does.
So let's talk very briefly, John, about the multi-party charter. There's a lot of talk about it before the election, that this was sort of a coming together of the anti-ANC opposition, the sort of definitively kind of ideologically opposed to the ANC opposition, IFP, Action SA, DA, Freedom Front Plus, ACDP, a bunch of other parties. But at the end of the day, it kind of just looks like a party that the MPC just looks like the DA and then some other parties. I wonder how enduring it's really going to be. What do you make of the MPC?
I think the MPC concept, has been greatly weakened by the fact that the many parties that were members of that agreement, except for the DA, didn't perform well in these elections. So if you know, the IFP had been at 5% and Action SA had been at 5%, maybe the ACDP at 2% or 3%, that would have been quite a substantial chunk. But the way it looks to be shaping up, it's going to be the DA plus a few 2-3% parties, maybe one below 1%, and that's not going to be enough, I think, to create a counterbalance to the ANC. So in this election, I think the MPC plan didn't work out. Maybe in 2029 that will be different. And I think that the notion of having a pro-growth coalition on one side opposing a set of parties that endorses and promotes pro-poverty policies is a useful dividing line to have. Whether it's a coalition on the one side, and on the other side, or an alliance or a grouping, that is really not that important. But it is important to have that dividing line quite clear in voters' minds. And I'll pick up here on a comment from one of the viewers who says, what do you need to do to get people excited about starting businesses here in South Africa? And I think you need the confidence to put money into this environment. And if we get some sort of ANC-DA cooperation, I think that can happen. I do think that there's a lot of pent-up demand for investing in South Africa amongst domestic companies, which are sitting on over R1 trillion in cash holdings, which they're afraid to deploy. Just give them a bit of confidence, and that money can be deployed, and that will make quite a big difference. And we're at this stage where we're right on the cusp, right on the edge of the decision whether that will happen or whether we go towards EFF and MK, in which case the opposite will happen. So this is a really critical moment in this country's history. A lot depends on which way things turn out over the next 2 weeks or so.
Yes, I think one of the things we can definitely say about South Africa after this election is that the country will be extremely different after this election. Whether it'll be different in a good way or different in a bad way remains to be seen. But I think 5 years from now, we will definitely be looking back on a very different country. So let's talk a little bit about some of these other kind of factors around the election. Let's firstly talk a little bit about how the IEC performed on the day. Now, on the show yesterday, gave my opinion on this, which is I think it was very bad. I observed the counting at a voting station, which I think was actually one of the better run voting stations. And it was, shall we say, fairly chaotic. Lots of very inexperienced, not that well trained staff for the IEC. At other voting stations, there were enormous numbers of problems. The biggest problem across the whole country seems to have been that the IEC put out these tablets that were supposed to have the voters' roll on them, which would allow people to be easily scanned in when they came in to vote to check that they were on the voters' roll. And that was kind of a bit of a disaster because a lot of them didn't work at all. And this was despite the IEC in the lead up to the election saying that those devices could work even if offline without any connection. In other places, the presiding officers, who are the IEC officials in charge of each voting station, apparently refused to actually cross people off the voters' roll and let them vote unless the machine worked. They were supposed to do it manually if the machine stopped working, and they didn't. So we had huge queues all over the place. Now, this is not universal. There were some voting stations that definitely were much more efficient and ran pretty quickly. I know some people have said it took them sort of 5 minutes to vote. But in general, it seems that the experience of that, particularly in Johannesburg, was not the case. I waited 90 minutes. Other people I know around me waited sort of 3 hours. There were people at voting stations who waited 8 or 9 hours. The producer of the show in Bali, I think she waited 2.5 to vote in the south of Joburg. So, Marius, let me start with you. I think pretty poor marks for the IEC on this election. Not great at all. What do you think?
Yeah, just from my personal experience, I actually went to my voting station 3 times because I went there in the morning and the queue was terrible, longer than I'd ever seen it. Then went back at about 7 o'clock and the queue was still terrible. So then I went back about an hour after that and stood in the queue from 8 until 9:45 before I eventually voted. And first I thought that the long queue was because we're seeing, and was the longest queue I've ever seen in my voting station. I've been voting there since 2014. But it seems the queue was so long was because, as you say, there were just problems with getting people to go through and all kinds of things. Our colleague Harriman Pretorius has said him and his wife, they both of them registered at a new voting station and said when they got there on Wednesday, they were told they had to go back to their old voting stations because they weren't captured on the voters' roll. When I was in the queue to go vote, a lady was behind me. They couldn't find her on the voters' roll and they didn't want her to vote. I'm not sure what happened because I didn't want to stand around for the drama, so I don't know if she was allowed to vote in the end. But it does seem there were quite a few problems, and I think part of it is because of poorly trained staff, as you say, and I think that comes down to a question of resources. The IEC has been getting less money in the past, although Treasury has said that that isn't as big an issue as it was. And they actually have been getting as much money as they need to. But there's obviously something up with it. And I think the problem with an IEC doing pretty poorly is that people, if they feel that they can't trust the IEC, then that has all kinds of implications for how the kind of the standard or how well democracy does in South Africa. Because as it stands now, I think most people accept that the results that come out of the IEC are pretty much what South Africans want. But if we get to a point where people, if we whatever, ANC gets 50%, people will say, well, can we actually trust the IEC or whatever the case is? So I think that's something to be worried about. And I know on Afrobarometer surveys, the IEC is not seen as think that is a concern. And the IEC is one of the most important, if not the most important institution when it comes to South African democracy.
Terence, your thoughts on the IEC? And then I just want to do one more topic before we close up for today.
It took me 45 minutes start to finish to vote. I made sure I showed up there at 7 o'clock in the morning, and we sailed through. So as far as my experience goes, top marks. But yeah, I think Marius is correct. This is putting on an election is an enormously difficult thing. You've got to train all sorts of people with systems they're not familiar with. They got no real personal context for, and if there's some sort of glitch or inconsistency in understanding, it can throw the entire station into chaos. So yeah, it also provides fodder for people who are desperate to find something wrong. Who want to claim that they've been done down. So yeah, going forward, be very careful of that.
So I'm just going to try and bring up another screen here. Last topic I want to talk a little bit about is polling. So we had much better polling in this election, I think, than previous elections, particularly from the Social Research Foundation, who had this tracking poll in the lead up to the election date. And well, if you look at the final results, the results they're sitting with now, this is the final prediction of the 58% turnout model from the Social Research Foundation, which is probably what the turnout is going to be in this election. ANC 41.6, which is kind of about where they are at the moment. DA 23.4, which is a little bit up from where they are at the moment. MK 12.1, which is almost exactly where they are at the moment. This poll seems to be a little bit beneficial to the EFF, putting them on 11.8. All the others 9, and the IFP 2.1, which seems to be a bit of an under poll. So, John, looks like the Social Research Foundation can definitely, I think, pat itself on the back at pulling off, particularly with this tracking poll, a pretty good polling result of the country. This is very accurate.
Yeah, what I thought, where I think that this result is useful, is that we saw quite a bit of criticism of the polling companies before the election, with people saying, look, if we don't know the methodology, we don't know who's commissioned it, we're unsure of the company, we don't trust polling in general, it influences elections, etc., etc. There was a lot of doubt being cast over polling as an activity. And I think there were even some calls for regulation, that there should be some regulation on polling. But I think what this shows us is that reputable companies stake their reputation on getting the calls right. This is really what they're judged on ultimately. And I think that the Social Research Foundation has performed very credibly here. I might also mention that my predecessor, Frans Cronje, in 2012, wrote a short paper predicting that in 2024 the ANC would lose its majority, and being laughed at in the media by very clever political professors and experts who said that he was completely out of touch with reality. Well, who's laughing now? So I think Frans got that call right. He's also the head of the Social Research Foundation. And I think with every call that he gets right, of course, his reputation grows, as it should. Yeah, we should be grateful and are grateful that these results were released. I mean, the Social Research Foundation might have kept them to itself if it had followed the calls of the media, and then none of us would have been the wiser until afterwards. But in this way, we were able to follow the progress of support for the various parties. And I thought that was a very instructive, illuminating, and also anxiety-inducing experience.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. Polling is never a perfect predictor of things, but I think it is an incredibly important tool for understanding just the sort of layout of an election. The things that polling generally tends to get wrong are the sort of last minute shifts in elections when undecided people who couldn't make up their minds get off the sidelines. And I think a lot of the famous polling misses in recent years, particularly overseas in places like the US and the UK, are as a result of not necessarily always adequately capturing those last minute undecideds or modeling for turnout. And I think one of the great things that the Social Research Foundation poll did in the lead up to this was they gave all these different turnout scenarios so that you could get an idea of how things would change if the election went. So, you see a 60% turnout model, 62% turnout model, and then the 58% turnout model, which was, I think, really accurate. Marius, anything to add on this point?
Yeah, I saw there was a political science professor from University of Pretoria. She tweeted Dr. Sitembile Mbete. So she quote tweeted one of the polls, and there was one saying the ANC is going to get about 40%, MK on 12 or 13, whatever it was. One of the polls, it's obviously turned out to be quite accurate, and said, "This is insane. How can it be? There's no ways the ANC is going to drop that that much. And I think we must not think that just because things have the way things have happened in the past are going to carry on happening. And that's exactly what's shown in this election. And that's often happens in democracies. I made the point in Canada in the early 1990s, the governing Conservative Party fell from 40% of the vote to 14 in one election, lost nearly all its seats in Parliament. It's happened in Lesotho in the last election there. It's happened in Israel in elections. So just because there's a precedent's been set doesn't mean that's going to carry on forever. So, and just on a final note, I think we can also be actually quite proud of this election. There were obviously a lot of problems with the IEC and so on, but it was a free and fair election in a lot of other countries in the world and on this continent. There wouldn't be an MK kind of party, there wouldn't be an EFF, and there wouldn't be a DA. Whatever you think of those parties, we're a democracy, and people need to be able to go make their voice heard, and they did. And people can pretty much go say what they want without being worried about being attacked or whatever the case is, or being thrown in jail. And obviously things are very uncertain now, but I think overall this is probably good for South African democracy. And yeah, I mean, I don't know if this is me clutching at straws, but I think South Africa is probably going to be a better place in 5 years' time than is today. Obviously, depending on the decisions that are made over the next couple of weeks and months and so on.
I certainly
I'd like
hope
to add
so.
something to that, if I may, Nick, which is just to echo Marius's words, and also say that what we're seeing is democracy working the way it's meant to, which is that you've got an incumbent party that isn't performing. It's not doing its job properly. People get upset with it, vote it out, and here you see the ANC at 42%. That's what's meant to be happening, and it's happening. That's really good.
All right, Terence, some final thoughts on this, and also maybe your final thoughts for the show as we close up.
I don't know how many times I've had to try and explain polling to people, and I'm not a pollster. But clearly, this is wishful thinking, and like they only asked 2,000 people. I mean, really, and we've had this, a while back when we endured a couple of months of sometimes scurrilous attacks in the media. I remember one prominent journalist at a very prominent outlet saying, "Imagine to just ask 2,500 people for their opinions." And it says something about your knowledge of sampling. I think it's also important to bear in mind that it's actually in the interests of a polling firm to try to produce fairly accurate results, because that's your reputation, and also your ability to market yourself, to do things like sample consumers' favorite favorite brands of potato chips, which is quite a lucrative thing to do. So yeah, I do wish that that warts and all people would try and understand these things before jumping to conclusions. Ultimately, though, as I always say, whatever the polls say is really quite unimportant after the voting's happened, because that's the only poll that really matters. And I would agree. We are a free society. We are a democracy. Story I like to tell is that I engaged with some people from President Ramaphosa's office a couple of years ago, and they said, the president doesn't like the stuff that you write about him. And I said, well, if he behaves properly, I'll write nice things about him. You can tell him that I say that. Funnily enough, I haven't been exiled to a small room where I can't sit down or lie down in the middle of the Northern Cape. All they do is they turn my electricity off from time to time, but that's what they do to the whole country. So what can you do? I think we should be very grateful for this and not take it for granted.
Marius, any final thoughts? And then I'll give the last word to John.
No, just Gareth's obviously been vindicated with this polling. And I've seen quite a few people on Twitter saying, this polling's ridiculous. Gareth's an idiot and a right-wing moron, blah, blah, blah. So I hope Gareth finds all those tweets and just, I don't know, sends him a smiley emoji or something like that. So
yeah, that being Gareth van Onselen, whose company Victory Polling, I think it's called, has been doing the polling that the SRF paid for. They can definitely take a victory lap. And John, final thoughts to you on this election and what it means for our future.
So echoing Terence's Marius's thoughts about being grateful for having a proper democracy, that's true. And I think also that we must acknowledge that the ANC has played a role in that. It has enjoyed a 30-year parliamentary majority. It had every opportunity to undo South Africa's democracy. It has not done so. It's respected the rules broadly, and that's very good of it. It is now facing electoral defeat. So far, I think it has taken it well. I imagine that in the Tuli House at the moment, the atmosphere is not the brightest, but nonetheless, the people have spoken. They have been critical of the ANC's performance, and that is showing in the results. And that is as it is meant to be. And if the ANC now makes the right choice, then I think the next 5 years are going to be volatile, but also promising. I think the opportunity is now there for some changes in policy, for realignment, and for maybe some investment to come to South Africa. Our investment rate is far too low for the economy to grow. That needs to rise. It can rise with a bit more confidence, and then the economy can also do a bit better. So yeah, not entirely a negative view if the right choices get made now. Nick.
Fantastic. All right. So apologies to viewers that my camera was being a bit odd this whole show, but hopefully you were kept entertained with the other guests and the results on the screen. And yeah, I would like to thank everyone for listening. We will, I think, probably talk more about this in the next couple of days as we get the final results. As you can see from the screen that I had up just a minute ago, we still are only at 2/3 of the votes counted. So the final result will be a little bit different from what we were seeing here today. But a fascinating election, and I think the next 2 weeks in South African politics as coalition talks get underway are going to be some of the most exciting and fascinating moments of our political history that we've had for many decades. Anyway, thank you very much, everyone, for watching. We hope that you have a wonderful day, and we will see you all soon with the Daily Friends Show. Cheers, everyone.